Aesthetics of beauty in art and culture. Aesthetics change. For instance, right now, I think you're seeing some fuller figures becoming popular. In the 70s, it was super, super thin. Aesthetics change, and they change in art and beauty as well, and the perceptions of what is beautiful. One common misconception is that all art should be beautiful. All art is not beautiful. Not at all. There is art that has political ramifications. There's art that is made to shock. There's a lot of that. And then there's just simply art that is made to draw someone's attention to a subject or maybe make them aware of something that they're not aware of. So there's all different types of motivation for art and the aesthetics of art. And some of it's about simple taste. You know, what I like, what you like, what the person next to you likes, completely different. And that's okay. So an aesthetic is more an object than it is functional, conceived to stimulate a sense of beauty in the viewer. And so when we talk about the aesthetics of art, an objectification in art, we're often talking about aesthetics as well. The Venus of Willendorf, Paleolithic, probably one of the first images of a woman. And they argue about the dates, but basically around 30,000 to 25,000 before Common Era. So 32,000 years ago, hard to believe. And so found in Vienna, she's only about 4 inches. All the things you can find on Amazon. Pretty here we are. Let's put her right. Now, let's see, where can you see her best? I guess I can hold her up. She's a little too orange. And so one of these days I'll get around to repainting her. But hey, what can you expect for 20 bucks or whatever it was I paid for it? But the Venus of Willendorf is an intriguing little figure. One of my students even gave me a soap of her because I do love her so much. So she's one of the icons in art history. I mean, if you're an art historian, you better know the Venus of Willendorf, in my opinion. Probably a fetish, a fertility object. Certainly her sexual parts have been emphasized, particularly her bust. She has these little teeny tiny spaghetti arms, which intrigue me because, ladies, when is the last time you walked around like this? Probably not. Almost looks like she might be expressing milk if she has just had a child. And they don't think she's fat. They do think she is abundant, and that this may have indeed been something that there was proof there was enough food. And so this idea of a fuller figure woman. Maybe. Don't know. Might it have been this little fetish? Might it have been something that someone put in their pocket as a good luck, some sort of good luck charm? Maybe, but she's a little bulky for that. But certainly could have been a household goddess. Sometimes they would have little things like this, little objects that were special. Do we still have things like that in many cultures? Absolutely. But I think she's amazing. It's interesting that she has this either hairstyle or hat. They argue about what's what. She's also interesting. She's no face. I mean, if I was to put this to music, I'd have I'm Every Woman basically blasting in the background because she is not an ideal. She's very much a woman you might see at the beach, except for the little spaghetti arms. That would be disturbing. But overall, she's just a type. And I think it's really intriguing that there is no face. And so we don't really know the background, but we love to conjecture what she might have been used for. And so she's, again, just a little tiny. And someone recently sent this to me or posted it on my social media or something, but I thought it was pretty funny because this woman certainly is more of our ideal of beauty. She is quite different than the Venus of Willendorf. So classical art is often held up as a beauty ideal. The Greco-Roman art has been very influential for centuries. The human form was created with a careful canon of proportions. The perfect proportions were defined by Polykleitos. It was a canon or rule. The head should be 1/8 of the total height. And I think it was Lysippos that felt it should be 1 to 7. But again, this idea of ratios and proportions were something that was being discussed. Also, for centuries, people thought that ideal art should be indeed white. And now we know that, of course, in Greco-Roman times, these were painted. There is evidence that these were painted. It's just a couple, let's see, around well over 1,000 years later, that paint was not there anymore. And so there is a common misconception that these were bright white. They were not. Now, during neoclassical time period, when they're looking back to the classical art, they did use bright white. They didn't use the a Carrara marble. They used even brighter marble. And so you do have whiteness, but it's typically pretty bright. And that is the work of Antonio Canova. Spear bearer, classical art. The original was lost. And this is the Dorophoros, 450 before Common Era, so 2,500 years ago. Roman copy after a Greek original. What this usually means is that the original probably was bronze and it was probably melted down. During wartime, art is some of the first things to go. So exemplifies this canon, or canon, it's spelled both ways. Numerous copies survive. Considered the perfect male body in this time period, and there was something called the heroic nude. The male form was admired above all else, even above the female form. Greeks like symmetry, balance, harmony. Architecture reflects similar aesthetics as well. So the Parthenon, Doric temple, and it was produced in 447 to 438 before Common Era. And it's in Athens on the Acropolis on the top of the hill. And it's dedicated to the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom, the gray-eyed one. Her symbols were the owl for wisdom. Based on the golden section, the width was 1.618 times the height, so 5 to 8. And so this building is even kind of mathematical, and it reflects beauty, symmetry, and balance. And it's absolutely stunning. I think it should be in everyone's must-see list. The imagination of the artist can also create a new aesthetic, a new perception, often not well received either. Pablo Picasso's masterpiece Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, these were basically prostitutes in Avignon or Barcelona. And he spent a long time working on this. He was very secretive about it. No one really knew what he was doing. And this is perceived as the first Cubist work or the first pre-Cubist work. They argue about things like that. Those get lost in the details. And it's the aesthetic of the ideal female has been completely revised in this work. And of course, this idea of showing women on a 2D plane, 3D, showing them in different sides, different angles, is interesting. And of course, Cubism was very, very influential. Not initially. Most things initially, the aesthetic is not well received, and it takes a while for people to get it or to have some positive associations with it. But most of the time, any art that is significantly different is not well received. So this is Five Prostitutes. I've always thought the woman that is squatting down is the most interesting because, first of all, it looks awkward. I don't think most women sit in this position, and certainly their head can't twist anywhere near as much as this woman's head has twisted around. He was inspired by the African aesthetic. African masks fascinated him, and he was collecting some of these things. In fact, he got even gotten a little bit of trouble over it because one of the things in which he had collected was indeed stolen. So, long story, but essentially I got in a little trouble over that. And you have a still life in the foreground, and then you have, of course, this limited palette with its cool blues. And then you have it against those warm oranges and peaches and browns. But this baffled people. One of the best readings of this, I think, and I think it's probably true, is this is in the early part of the 1900s. Picasso was terrified of syphilis and disease. And so he was also a pretty misogynistic male, understatement, and certainly he had many lovers and 2 wives, and it does reflect his fear, perhaps, of women with sharp edges. So he did numerous preparatory sketches for it. And the work, when you see it, it's at the MoMA in New York. It's pretty interesting. It's larger than you'd expect. And he originally conceptualized it as also including 2 males as well. But that didn't happen. He ended up taking those out. So here you can see a mask. And you can certainly see the connection to African influence as well. And Matisse also did it as well. So he was interested in Greek, Iberian, African art at the time. And the work changed the art world when seen in Picasso's studio. I mean, even Georges Braque, who later embraced Cubism, did not like this work initially. Most people just kind of thought he'd gone crazy. So the original sketch contained, also included a sailor and another man, a medical student, which the medical student kind of supports the idea that the women could have been syphilitic. And so certainly that's a possibility, but who knows. He rebelled against the whole idea of feminine beauty and basically set out to destroy a whole canon of Western aesthetics. Do I think that was intentional? No, I think he was experimenting. And if you look at Picasso's long history, because he lived a long time, well, he went through many phases. Now, interestingly enough, stylistically, his style tended to change with his women. It's pretty interesting when you see how when the women's change, his manner of painting changes as well. Not considered particularly attractive or beautiful, considered modern, freedom of expression for the artist. Most think it's kind of threatening, reminiscent to a certain extent of Gertrude Stein's portrait, which took a while for Picasso to get. Mask equals fear of darkness, according to Sayre. Now, in African art, masks can have very positive connotations, but again, they can also have, in Western culture, more negative connotations. So freedom from close representation, but the public soundingly rejected this work, and it remained all but invisible for 3 decades when it finally found an audience in the US. And so it seemed to everyone something mad or monstrous. The dealer Daniel Henry Conwell Weiler recalled, Duran told me that one day Picasso would be found hanging behind this big painting. So I've often compared Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase of 1912 to Picasso's work. It's different, it's other, and it also was not well received. Nude descending a staircase is a few years after Picasso's work, but this was also ridiculed a great deal. In fact, Marcel Duchamp didn't take it very well and went off in a different direction in his art. Shown at the New York Armory Show, it had 70,000 visitors, traveled to Chicago and Boston. Ultimately, 300,000 people viewed this modern Armory Show. Initially, the Armory Show was not particularly well received, but it did generate interest, and so people started to want to understand and want to see it. So sometimes even bad press is good press, because people did go to see it, and it changed things because modernity took off in the United States largely. You know, there was always some resistance in the beginning, but it changed things. President Teddy Roosevelt told the papers the painting reminded him of a Navajo blanket, and there was cartoons about it. It was ridiculed. So American Art News held a contest to find the nude in the painting. The winning entry declared, "It isn't a lady, but only a man." And no, it wasn't male. Man Ray did this photograph of Marcel Duchamp basically going down the stairs, and kind of recreated the idea of the kinetic movement of the body moving down the staircase. And then it was also appropriated by another person who did the same thing, but they did it with female nude. So a more traditional view of a nude, a Venus figure, made more acceptable for its nudity because it was mythological, culturally elevating. Giorgione's beautiful sleeping Venus. And this is one of the first works of a reclining nude. Yes, there had been a reclining nude in antiquity, the sleeping hermaphrodite, that was Hellenistic. And there was a few others, but for the most part, he was the one that set the bar as far as the reclining nude in art history. He died young of a plague, and the background was probably finished by the hand of Titian, who was a friend, and he supposedly received some training under Giorgione as well. 28 years later, Titian produces this work, and it does look back to Giorgione's work. You still have the framing device of the fabric. You have the Venus laid out in a very similar manner to Giorgione. She's not in a countryside. Here she is inside of a palace. You have beautiful tapestries on the wall. That was because they didn't have central heating, and these palaces got cold. They also, in the background, there are attendants, and they are digging around in these trunks, these chests that would have held their belongings. And you also have the dog, the foot of the bed, symbol of fidelity. Venus was often shown with roses, symbol of beauty. Sometimes she's shown with a mirror, gazing at her lovely, beautiful self in a mirror. She has that Titian red hair, of which Titian was known for, this blondish red color that was Titian red. And she was, of course, much admired. They believe that the Venus of Urbino was probably a betrothal portrait or a marriage portrait, not of the bride. That wouldn't have happened, not an upper class woman posing for Titian. But you might have had a mistress do so. and you might have had a model do so. And so this might have been very much something that would have been in a private room, but it's really quite gorgeous. Diego Velázquez's gorgeous Venus figure here, the Rokeby Venus. This was commissioned by a pious religious king, Philip IV. There are numerous letters written to nuns asking for them to pray for him and asking him for forgiveness. He had no less than 32 illegitimate children. And he was a court painter, and this is believed to be a mistress of the king, who was known for these beautiful black satiny sheets. The Venus figure is shown with Cupid, which is the offspring of Venus. Venus is, of course, the goddess of love, the goddess of sensual love, and she's Aphrodite in the Greek, and she is Venus in the Roman. And here she's gazing at this mirror, who's again one of the attributes of Venus, is her gazing at her mirror. And yet you notice that you really should be seeing her shoulders and maybe her breasts, but you don't, because it's during the Inquisition. I think it's a gorgeous work. It also has that beautiful framing device, looking back to Giorgione's red, and the style is more in the style of Titian's green. And then you also have her beautiful skin, and again, we don't see the front because of the Inquisition, and the reason being, he could have gotten in a lot of trouble, could have even been killed, so it wasn't something that was done. But it's a breathtaking work, the Rokeby Venus. The Odalisque. This is a tradition of a harem girl, specifically a Turkish harem girl. And this was something that was romanticized in literature and certainly romanticized in art as well. Certainly, these women were often taken not of their free will, and they often are anglicized as well. You know, they're often shown with white skin, when indeed they would probably be more olive-skinned. The one on the top is by Frederick Bazille. He was the one that associated with the Impressionist, but he died during the Franco-Prussian War, and he died during the Franco-Prussian War early in the 1870s, so he didn't fully develop as an Impressionist. Now Delacroix is also one of the people that inspired Bazille, this Delacroix figure. And so opposite of the neoclassicists, who are painting very polished and crisp, this has that a little bit of a soft quality to it. And you often get that. I often tell my students, if it looks like someone has taken their hand and rubbed softly across, it might be romanticism, and that's sometimes true. So it's dramatic, it's emotional, it's passionate, and it's very much about the individual. Now, deep, rich colors, quick brushwork, strong lighting. Goethe said, feeling is all. And so this was a response to the Age of Reason, to the Enlightenment. So here's a full vision of Bazille's beautiful Odalisque. This was the work that when he showed his parents, they finally realized, okay, he does have some talent. He came from a wealthy family, and they weren't delighted with his choice to become an artist. Here we have Rubens' Odalisque, in a sense, but she's actually called Venus and her Mirror. And so she also looks rather exotic here, with the exotic slave girl standing behind her. You have Cupid holding the mirror, and she has these long, luscious gold locks. She has the jewelry on her arm. One of the reasons you know it's Rubens is because there's cellulite. He liked fuller figures. Indeed, Delacroix's work has a fuller figure as well. And some of that was because in this time period, women often died of childbirth. So the idea was that if a woman had fuller hips, it might be unlikely that she would die of childbirth. Of course, we know that it has more to do about genetics today, but again, that was the perception in certain times. But Rubens also had a taste for fuller-figured young women. You see it repeatedly in his work. Rubenesque, this is the Three Graces. Aglaia represents elegance, splendor, grace. Thalia represents youth, beauty, charm. Euphrosyne, mirth, joyfulness. And does this picture make me look fat? No, you look Rubenesque. So yes, Flemish artist. Peter Paul Rubens was a diplomat. He was internationally well known. He was very popular. He was successful in his lifetime. And he was, he's not one of those artists that have this tragic story. No, he lived quite well. So Rubenesque defined, characteristic or reminiscent of the paintings of Rubens, especially his voluptuous female nudes. And here we have Rubens' Jupiter and Callisto. So, Rubenesque today, yes, I think we still see it. I think we see some full figures. We certainly see a number of full figure models. Do I think the aesthetic is changing? Yeah, I do. I think there are different forms that are perceived of as beautiful today. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, Grand Odalisque, one of his famous works, also has been called tongue-in-cheek woman with an extra vertebra. Her back looks impossible. Her hip looks somewhat impossible as well. She's kind of pear-shaped, much fuller hips and more narrow on the top. But beautiful, beautiful skin, very much anglicized, especially for an odalisque. You have a scent, you have incense burning, you have a hookah pipe, you have this beautiful exotic fan with the peacock feathers. Peacock feathers were a symbol of Hera, so that could also be perceived of as a symbol of beauty as well. She's wearing this exotic Turkish headdress, and turbans were often popular as well in the 18 and 1900s for women, for that exoticism. So this also has been described as mannerism, this idea of she looks elongated, she looks stretched. And so you could also compare her to Parmigianino's Madonna of the Long Neck, 1534. That baby, does that baby look mannerist? Oh yeah, it looks like it's just been pulled out like putty. And then if that Madonna was to actually stand, she'd probably be, 9 feet tall? Some hierarchy of scale going on here. The most important figure is larger than everything else. I also think that's the sexiest leg in art history. We have this angelic leg on the framing, the frame, and it's an angel's leg. It's pretty intriguing, I think. So perceptions of beauty change with generations, culture, different time periods. What is beautiful? In the Burma tribe, the values of an aesthetic they value the aesthetics of a very long neck. And so here you see how women's necks are expanded such with ring after ring after ring, such that after a while, I don't think they can hold their head up unless they have the rings. A Thailand woman with the long neck emphasized, so it's not exclusive to African tribes alone. So there was a time in Western history that a long neck was perceived as beautiful and elegant. Is it true today? To a certain degree, I think so. Italian mannerist painter Modigliani, he's elongating that form. And so you see Modigliani in his portraits often has that elongated neck. So Jean, Amedeo Modigliani's common law wife, who he painted many times, they were about to get married when he passed away from tuberculosis and perhaps alcoholism and drug use. He simply collapsed. He was very ill. And Grisaille, this is a style of monochromatic painting in shades of grayscale. And you can see how the aesthetic is quite different, losing the color. It's much more simplified. And so here you can see a detail of that a beautiful face in this particular image. In Birth of Venus, you have this goddess that is being born out of the foam of the sea. Specifically, the testicles of Uranus, the great god Uranus, were cast into the sea, and I'm completely paraphrasing, but basically all of the foam generated and formed the great goddess of Aphrodite, who becomes Venus. And so quite the birth story. There's another version of her birth as well that's not nearly as dramatic or enthralling. So Alexander Cabanal's Birth of Venus, this is an example of academic painting. It looks polished, it looks refined, it looks white. She almost looks sculptural. She's very much the aesthetic of beauty for the time period. Her hips are certainly fuller. There's no pubic hair. There's no hair under her arms. She's been described as one art historian as looking like a giant baby. And it is mythological. So I'm looking at this and I'm, of course, thinking of mythology. And no, you're thinking of, if it was produced for the male gaze, I'm sure they were thinking about more than mythology when they were gazing at this work. It sold for $40,000 to Napoleon III, but the public hated it. Hated it. It was ridiculed. And they talked about the sheets being dirty. They talked about her feet stinking. Her hand looks frog-like. They liked nothing about it. The thing was that they didn't think she was traditionally attractive. They didn't like the giant flower that's kind of open in her hair. That was symbolic of, well, it's not a tight little rosebud, let's just say that. And they didn't like the fact that her gaze would be directed towards the male gaze, was very much in your face. And it was a theme that people didn't want to deal with. They certainly didn't want to see it in art. Art should be elevating. Art should be about mythology, historical themes, biblical themes. Nudity was fine, but again, couched in mythology and history and that sort of thing. She's not nude, she's naked. And that was very different. So there was cartoons, and they didn't, again, I think it's fascinating. They thought the sheets looked dirty. I think it's mostly because it was the style of painting he was doing, lots of halftones, lots of bold swaths. It was not meticulously rendered. Now, of course, it's a prized painting, and it's a truly beloved painting. But you could see here where they're again making a fun of her kind of flaneur type body. She's got the top hat on. You have the sense that she's got, dirty socks on, and there was really nothing about it they loved. Now, I also included a detail of where you could see some of the details of the jewelry, of course, it's a prostitute. Now, the choker is interesting. I remember in the 70s, I thought chokers were cool, and particularly black chokers. And I remember my mother saying, "You can't wear a black choker. That's what hookers wear." And so when I saw this painting years later, I remembered that. So again, very suggestive. And the model was Victorine Meurent, who also modeled for him in several other works. At one point in time, he'd offered her one of his paintings, and she didn't take him up on it. Big mistake, because of course they became very, very valuable. And later, after his death, she asked his wife for one of his paintings, and she said no. And so maybe a little jealousy about his models, certainly. And so now another thing that's interesting is, for the most part in art history, the servant girl has largely been ignored, but her name was Laure, and she actually posed for him in other works as well. Your Body is a Battleground. This is Barbara Kruger. And symmetry is one of the main things that makes people think someone is beautiful, is if your face is completely symmetric. Most people's face is not. We have an eyebrow that's larger. We have a cheekbone that's a little higher. Most people do not have symmetry in their body or their face. Race is also considered. Word and photograph pieces relate to billboard imagery, addressing the feminist issues of gender. Abortion argument also relates to this work. A woman's body becomes a political battlefield. But again, also a woman is sometimes simply dismissed, and her opinion is sometimes dismissed. And so Your Body is a Battlefield is a very general statement. Kruger often uses text in her work, and especially this palette, this black and white, and then with a red. And so this is kind of one of her signature styles. So it grabs us by the color and booms, don't be a jerk. And so lives in both New York and LA, last I checked. And presently doing installation work, writes poetry as well. Marie-Louise Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, daughter with Mir. And so even in the 18th century, there were questions with aesthetics of beauty. What is beautiful? Here you see this young girl looking in a mirror, and you see her wondering about herself. Having a perception about herself, and I think this happens very, very young with children, perhaps a little bit more with girls than boys. So here you can see a little closer detail of it. And she just had the one daughter. Vigée Lebrun was court painter to Marie Antoinette. So, successful woman artist, very surprising in the time period in which she was working. She was very talented. Marie Antoinette spent obsessive amounts of money on fashion. She did set some trends, and certainly the excess of the royals' lifestyle contributed to the French Revolution. But she was by no means the first to be excessive. Blonde was fashionable. They powdered their hair, and it actually looks more gray than blonde, actually, but again, that was what they used. Have you ever stood in line at the grocery store and looked at the magazines that are all around the front? And the women look so perfect. If it's a picture of a home, everything looks so perfect. And it creates a sense of unreality. Certainly, it doesn't add to our security at all. Magazines, do they lower self-image? Probably. They've certainly been criticized for furthering an unrealistic, thin, ideal body type. The standard for female beauty is a size 4 hip, size 2 waist, and a size 10 bust. This body is both thinner than the average woman and almost genetically impossible for most to attain. It's no wonder why a woman's body image decreases after only 3 minutes of viewing magazines. This was according to a Missouri.edu researcher. So how they measured that, I'm not entirely sure. But do I think it's pretty factual? I'm pretty sure. So there is a way for women, and you could also say men, because there's men's magazines too, to avoid falling victim to a decreased body image after reading their favorite magazines. The key is reading with media literacy, says Mintz, a professor. Look at the magazines with a critical eye and know that the women on the pages are not realistic. They're airbrushed. The pictured bodies may be constructed with body parts from various women. We know this logically, but again, I think sometimes we forget. So certainly I think women, a bit more than men, are a slave to aesthetics, to fashion. But I don't think it's necessarily exclusive to women, not at all. The polished, impossible, airbrushed images are unrealistic for normal women to achieve. Yes, there are definitely archetypes that young girls grow up with. But again, I don't think it's exclusive to women. I definitely think it's about men too. In pop culture, there is definitely a different aesthetics of beauty. Do I think it's changing a bit? I do. It would have been unheard of 20 years ago for somebody to have butt implants, for instance. So Twiggy, Paris Hilton, Kardashians, Kelly Clarkson, lots of women have really struggled with what is beautiful. I think they continue to do so. All the accoutrements of beauty, Audrey Flack's collage, Marilyn Vanitas, 1977. She's known for her photorealistic works. Norma Jean, of course, becomes Marilyn. And Norma Jean goes through struggles with her body. She goes through struggles with her hair. She changes her name. She changes everything about herself, truly. And this is what she is showing in this Vanitas image. A Vanitas image is an all-is vanity image. These were particularly popular in the 17th century. Often associated with death imagery. You'll see a candle, you'll see a skull, you might see a shell on the beach. These are things that are passing away. Audrey Flack, Jolie Madame, 1972, National Gallery, Australia. So this trompe l'oeil images that look hyper realistic. It's something that also is associated with the painting for the surrealist. Photorealism, a style of art characterized by highly detailed objects, often from ordinary life. In computer graphics, the rendering of images in an extremely realistic manner. Now, if you think about, I often ask this to my class when we're face to face. Ladies, think about how many products you might use on your hair, on your skin in one day. It's probably a pretty high number, because once you include shampoo, conditioner, some sort of oil, some sort of hairspray, and then makeup, deodorant, and again, you just go through this list. For a lot of women, that number is quite high. Then I ask men the same question, and they're like, 3 things. Now, that's not always true. Again, I'm making sweeping generalizations here that are not always accurate. But the point is that there are a lot of products that are geared towards women and women's hygiene and women's hair care and women's makeup. And again, there is a definite difference between how long it takes a woman to get dressed in the morning and how long it takes a man to get dressed in the morning. But again, there are exceptions. I know that. So here are more of Audrey Flack's images. When you kind of do a screenshot, you can see the hyperrealism. Barbie. Well, Barbie is certainly an impossible reality. I mean, I think there is some woman that's had multiple plastic surgeries so that she looks more like Barbie. Why she'd want to look like Barbie, I don't know, but yes, she actually went through multiple surgeries, and unfortunately, she ended up looking kind of freaky. But it does happen, and women decide that this is the what they want to be. This is Adios Barbie, a quote. "We urban, Jewish, Black, Asian, Latina girls began to realize slowly and painfully that if you didn't look like Barbie, you didn't fit in. Your status was diminished. You were less beautiful, less valuable, less worthy. If you didn't look like Barbie, blonde hair, blue eyes, companies would discontinue you. You simply couldn't compete." And I hope that's changing. Certainly these questions are being addressed in Hollywood, in other venues as well. But certainly the message that young girls do receive when they receive multiple images and dolls that all look like Barbie is that this is desirable. So it has to change. So you have Milan, and certainly this idea of women of color, girls of color, is something that is definitely in the process of changing, and has been, I think, for a number of years. I mean, I know when my daughters were little, we had black Barbies, we had, I think there was even one wheelchair Barbie, if I remember correctly, but all different types of Barbies. And again, it was just starting then, and my girls are in their late 20s, early 30s now. And so it was starting then, but I think it's very, very much becoming more developed now. So here you go. So I thought this was a great picture that really definitely shows that we do need to change. People come in all different colors, all different shapes, all different sizes. Kimono, Japonism in art. Kimono means to wear. The plural of kimono is simply kimono, and they've changed over time and society and culture. Japanese women today are said to usually only own one kimono. They're often used in families and passed down from member to member. And so they can be considered something that is very, very special. But sometimes objects that are not perceived of as new are also not perceived of as valuable in some cultures, and that's true as well. And so in any case, it's a beautiful object used for special occasions. It's certainly been embraced in art, mid-1800s. Red blossom kimono, traditional Japanese style kimono with a red floral print. Red is particularly auspicious, lucky, and so it's a positive color. And it was made for 18-inch American Girl dolls. So we're seeing progress. We are. So Japonism is reflected in European art in the mid-1800s, well into the 1900s as well, as trade with Japan opened up. Now, mind you, Japan was forced to open up that trade. It was not made. They did not desire to open up their ports and to begin trading. It was forced, but it ultimately did happen. And so the Europeans fell in love with the prints. They fell in love with the palette, the style, and it was so foreign to what they had ever seen before that they particularly were interested in it. So Claude Monet, of course, is most famous for this image, which is Impression Sunrise. And so these were produced both in the 1870s, around the same time period. So if you have any questions of whether or not he could paint academically, he could, because this is painted very academically. The brushwork is very, very detailed. You can see the kabuki character very, very clearly. She's got this beautiful contrapposto posed, this S shift. And then there's all these gorgeous, detailed Japanese fans on the wall. behind them as well. So Monet, of course, is most known for this particular work, Impression Sunrise. And these were both produced in the same time period. And Impression Sunrise, there's no discernible foreground, middle ground, background. He was interested in the changing values of light. If he looks out the window in the morning and he looks out the window in the afternoon, it's going to be very, very different even in the evening. The changing values of light change the way everything looks. And so he was very interested in these ideas. And so this is a harbor view, and it was also done in plein air, which means it was not produced in the studio. It was produced outside, where he was painting outside in plein air. So a tidal wave of these imports come into Europe. Woodcuts, ukiyo-e prints, hokusai's work. Parisians saw Japanese arts and crafts at the World's Fair of 1867. Shiploads of bric-a-brac, kimonos, red lacquers, bronzes began pouring into England and France. James Tissot, women admiring Japanese objects. And so this was an aesthetic that was completely different than anything they'd ever seen before. And so it was interesting to them. Young women looking at Japanese objects, young women holding Japanese objects, and in the first one, the women look very, very European. In the second one, it's kind of hard to tell. It looks like a European woman per se dressing in the style of a Japanese woman, but I'm unsure. She still also looks like she may be Japanese as well. But these are more clear. These are ukiyo-e prints, floating world prints, Japanese courtesan culture. They lived in the Edo district, and this was an area where originally it was supposed to be an area where you went to listen to music, listen to poetry, and then unfortunately it evolved into something quite different, and it evolved into prostitution ultimately. But that didn't happen for a while. And so here the women are shown with these elaborate kansashi sticks in their hair. And originally these sticks actually denoted that they were prostitutes if they had these in their hair. But then what happened is a lot of the women saw them and thought they were beautiful, and so they started wearing them, and it became a fashion. So living only for the moment, turning our full attention to the pleasures of the moon, the snow, the cherry blossoms. Cherry blossoms are really big in their art. And maple leaves, singing songs, drinking wine, diverting ourselves and just floating, caring not a whit for the pauperism staring us in the face, refusing to be disheartened like a gourd floating along the river. This is what we call the floating world. And so this is from the 1600s, a Buddhist monk and popular writer. And so this idea of the floating world, again, there's no sense here as he's writing about necessarily prostitution, but that did evolve later. Kasai Eisen's courtesan, and so another example. And again, look at how elaborate those hair is with all of those kansashi sticks. And these were called bajinga pictures, pictures of beautiful women. And the picture that is actually on the wall looks like a hokusai print. Cherry blossoms are also symbols of courtesans and also symbols of spring. And so cherry blossoms on the banks of the Sumida River. And so there was, these women were kept contained in this floating world, contained in this area in Edo. And on Cherry Blossom Day, they were allowed out. They could even visit friends or family that had some contact with them, although some didn't. But it was the one day a year that they were allowed some freedoms. Hiroshige, spring blossoms, 19th century. And so these were highly circulated because these were prints. And so consequently, they did get a great deal of attention, and they were popular, and they were widely produced to many classes, not just the wealthy, because they were prints. Vincent van Gogh also did some images of cherry blossoms, and one of the cafes that he would frequent would have Japanese prints on the wall, and that was his inspiration. They're a symbol, almond trees are a symbol of new life, Japanese printmaking influence, and this was also a gift for Theo and his sister-in-law, Jo. Obi sash, 3 to 18 inches wide, worn with kimono. And again, the kanzashi hair ornaments. And then indeed, this is Vincent van Gogh's print that was completely copied from Kasai Eisen. So again, this was very much a theme for Van Gogh as well, these blossoms, these spring blossoms. So this is the original, and then of course it was also done by Van Gogh. But these big head or Bajinga prints were very popular, these beauties as they were sometimes called. Here you see a limited palette. This was something that was also appealing. You see, for instance, in some prints that this palette shows up in Western paintings. So it even affected their palette. So pictures of the floating world, the Yoshiwara district. This was a pleasure district outside of Edo. So here we also have a more contemporary example, and it's called Cherry Blossom Storm 1953. The palette in this work is certainly different than some of Mary Cassatt's other works, and there's definitely, you can see some of the details that are a result of Japonism. Also, the interesting cropping is partly Japanese. It's also partly the influence of photography. Her and Degas were fascinated with interesting cropping that you could do with photography. Fabrication, certainly you can see that connection. And this kind of flatter use of space, it's a little bit more shallow, doesn't go in as much. That's also one of the features of Japonism. 1100 AD, the Sung Dynasty, foot binding. Women thought to be beautiful, they needed to have tiny feet, 3 inches long. They got these tiny feet by wrapping tight bandages around the feet of little girls who were about 5 to 6 years old. The bandages were so tight that they broke the girls' toes and bent them underneath their feet, and then they had to walk. The girls cried a lot for 2 to 3 years, and then the feet stopped hurting so much. The earliest versions of the story of Cinderella are said to actually have come from the Sung Dynasty, interestingly enough. And these were upper-class women. They didn't have to do a lot around the house, so it was perfectly fine for them to sit all day and keep their little delicate feet comfortable. But again, before we judge too harshly the ancient tradition of foot binding, which continued for centuries, consider the contortions some women's shoes require of the foot even today. I mean, some of the shoes I see some women walk in are unbelievable. I did it when I was a teenager mostly, but I've long since given up that. But again, you can really destroy your feet using really bad shoes. But some of them look so cool, but again, yeah. Other shoe imagery in art, Van Gogh's shoes and Magritte's Cyrillus, the Red Model. Magritte's titles almost never match the subject matter. They often have a strange title. Van Gogh had a fascination for representing shoes as a symbol of the honest work of the common working man. They recur over and over again, as do portraits of what is believed to be his shoes as well. Of course, the original story of Cinderella is believed to have originated in Chinese culture. Cinderella, of course, had very tiny feet to fit the slipper and win, of course, the prince. In the early Grimm's fairy tales, the stepsisters of Cinderella actually cut off their toes to try to fit in the shoes. It's really grisly. Bound to be Beautiful, foot binding in ancient China exhibition. Beauty has been a major goal, again, forever. Many cultures and peoples have different views of beauty. In the 19th century, corsets that made a woman's waist as small as possible were considered to be a beauty requirement. Body piercing and tattoos fell under the same category, although the health consequences are not as severe. Pain has been suffered for centuries by women and men to achieve perceived beauty. So Catherine Beecher felt that corsets made exercise impossible and were not good for women's health. And this is a more contemporary example of women in different corsets. And this was, of course, is related to fashion. Still very much a fashionable look, although we're not using whalebone anymore to make it extremely tight and controlled. Edwardian corset, examples of 1900s Edwardian women. It's said to have actually shifted organs around. Late 1800s, early 1900s, fashion preoccupied many Edwardian women, especially when they had the money to follow it. But their role models weren't actresses, models, or singers. Alexandra, both as Princess of Wales and Queen, was seen as the leader of Edwardian fashion with her beautiful clothes, high-piled hair, and distinctive multi-stranded pearl chokers. An Edwardian lady married to a wealthy man would buy her finest dresses from Paris, the mecca for fashionable women at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, in the early 1900s as well, the idea of the Gibson girl was actually promoted by the artist Charles Gibson, and he was an illustrator. His works were largely circulated. He was extremely well known, and so the idea of the Gibson girl, also with her elaborate poof, was also that was driven by Charles Gibson. These are examples of Charles Gibson's ladies, and they were actually inspired by his wife, but they truly set the fashion for probably 20 years. Certainly, they were extremely, extremely influential. So, corsets saw transitional styles between the Victorian hourglass corset and the straight-fronted corset of the Edwardian era. Corsets often have an hourglass shape, and again, were often reinforced with bone, even whalebone. Here you can see the teeny tiny waist of Lady Agnew in John Singer Sargent's work. Lady Agnew had horrible anemia, probably because she didn't eat. Look how tiny she is. But in any case, they were subject to fainting spells, even broken ribs. In order to have a small waist, many women ate very, very little. And their dress was elaborate, so they usually had to have maidservants put them into these costumes and cinch them to get them into it. So this is one of a very popular work of John Singer Sargent. Even in its time, it was very, very well received. This is a wealthy woman, but I love her face. This does not look like a stupid woman. This looks like a determined woman. And so it's, again, one of the key works in art history. Issey Miyake, Red Corset, 1980s. I thought this was simply striking. The hard body is central to the exhibition. Hardness is associated with strength and power. The relationship between body and clothes has changed dramatically. Women and men seek to achieve strong, attractive bodies. This red bustier in the form of a naked female torso is a tribute to these attributes. And so it also is said to honor bodybuilding. Berthe Morisot's On the Balcony. Here you have this heavy bustled bum that you can see here. And she's shown with her only daughter, Julie. And this is Berthe Morisot, the Impressionist, the female Impressionist. Tissot's The Letter, and a detail of a Victorian bustle and dress. 1850s to 1900 is roughly the Victorian period. And so we have here Woman of Ambition, 1880s. And then you can also see the model of the dress as well in the first image. So the Victorian bustle, also known as the Grecian bend, was first in fashion 1870s to 1875. So right in the beginning when the Impressionists started. Later, the bustle was in fashion 1880s to early 1890s. James Tissot. This is one of my favorite paintings of James Tissot. Here are these beautiful women, and they're kind of looking out at the landscape, and there's the young man that appears to be looking largely at them. And so Tissot certainly shows a lot of the fashion. In fact, he was a little dismissed because his works were so detailed and the dresses so very fashionable. And so sometimes his work was dismissed because of it. But of course, now it's, I think, very gorgeous and very popular. But again, he still has not received the same recognition of many other academic artists. Now, Tissot did receive plenty of money in his time period because people did want him to paint them because he would paint such beautiful, beautiful works. So curvy women have been the fashion long before the Kardashians, but again, there's an ebb and flow of fashions. And nautical themes are also very common in Tissot's works because he grew up close to the sea, and it becomes something that stays close to his heart. But I think it's a truly gorgeous work. So again, I hope this overview kind of was interesting to you. Certainly lots of different things change, fashions change. Certainly, like I said, in the 70s, the extremely skinny girl was popular. But again, I hope in time everything gets a lot more balanced.